When Apollo 11 landed on the moon in 1969, history was made 240,000 miles away from Earth. But as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped out into the lunar dust, they had a watch, and it wasn't a Rolex. So how did Omega manage to out-engineer the king of luxury watches and claim the biggest bragging rights in human history? You're just about to find out in today's episode of the most intense watch competition ever staged. But before we talk about how Omega overthrew Rolex, you need to understand the paperwork. In September 1964, NASA's Flight Crew Operations Director, Dake Slayton, sent out a formal request to roughly 10 watch manufacturers. The task was simple on paper. Just build a chronograph durable enough for astronauts to wear during training and flight. Big names were on that list: Omega, Rolex, Longines, Hamilton, even Lucien Piccard. At this point, Rolex was already the undisputed heavyweight of tool watches. They had built the Submariners for divers, the Explorer for mountaineers, and their name was basically shorthand for the watch that survives anything. If anyone was expected to win a durability contest, it was Rolex. Most of them didn't even respond. Some requests went to American distributors who never bothered relaying the message back to Switzerland. Others just sat there, ignored. In 1964, supplying a government chronograph program was not a prestige assignment, but paperwork nobody wanted to deal with. Only 4 companies actually sent something. Hamilton sent a watch, except it wasn't a wristwatch, it was a pocket watch, so NASA disqualified it instantly, with no testing required. That left 3 contenders. Rolex sent their reference 6238, a chronograph now nicknamed the pre-Daytona. Longines-Wittnauer also sent their 235T, and Omega sent the Speedmaster reference 105.003. But which one would survive what NASA had planned for them? NASA's testing protocol was less a watch test and more of an attempt to break these watches in every way mechanically possible. Worth noting, these weren't custom prototypes built for the space program either. Each company pulled standard, off-the-shelf models and submitted them straight from their regular catalogue. Imagine your everyday watch ending up in a NASA lab. The watches were baked at 70 centigrade or 158 Fahrenheit for 2 days, then immediately frozen down to minus 18 centigrade or 0 Fahrenheit. They were also sucked into vacuum chambers, blasted with 95% humidity and sealed inside highly explosive oxygen. Then came the physical abuse. All the selected watches were strapped into machines that smashed them with heavy shock impacts and vibrated them violently. Unfortunately, under these apocalyptic conditions, the competition fell apart fast. That's why when the results came back on March 1st, 1965, they weren't close. The Rolex 6238 stopped running entirely twice during the humidity test. Then it failed the high temperature test too, when the chronograph's second hand warped and jammed against the other hands on the dial. NASA didn't run it through anything else after that. Also, the Longines-Wittnauer 235T didn't make it much further. Its crystal warped under heat and it lost its seal with the case on 2 separate units. On the flip side, the Omega Speedmaster wasn't flawless either. It gained 21 minutes during the decompression test and lost 15 minutes during acceleration. Even the luminous paint on the dial was destroyed in the process, but it kept running. And at the end of 11 trials designed to break it, the Speedmaster was the only watch still standing. Part of that came down to a simpler internal design. The Speedmaster's movement had fewer moving parts exposed to thermal expansion than its rivals, so when the metal swelled and contracted under extreme heat and cold, there was less for it to jam against. It wasn't the most accurate watch in the test, it was just the hardest one to stop. However, surviving the test was only part of it. The story that changed the Speedmaster from the Moonwatch into a watch that saved lives happened on a mission that never made it to the moon. On April 15, 1970, the Apollo 13 spacecraft was 200,000 miles from Earth when an oxygen tank violently exploded. The moon landing was cancelled and the mission became a fight for survival. The crew had to evacuate into a tiny lunar module to use it as a life raft. To save their dying battery power, the crew turned off almost every piece of electronics, including the main flight computer. The cabin dropped to near freezing, frost coated the windows, and the dark spacecraft began to drift wildly off course. If they hit Earth's atmosphere at the wrong angle, they would either bounce off into deep space forever or burn up instantly. They needed to manually fire the rocket engine to straighten out, but without a computer, how do you time a rocket blast down to the exact second? Commander Jim Lovell steered the ship using the literal curve of the Earth out of the window. Fred Hayes managed the throttles, and Jack Swigert looked down at his wrist. He was wearing his NASA-issued Omega Speedmaster. Swigert was even supposed to be on this flight. He was a last-minute replacement after the original pilot was exposed to measles days before launch. Now, with the whole crew's survival riding on a single number, that backup astronaut became the one holding the stopwatch. The rocket blast had to last exactly 14 seconds, so Swigert clicked the stopwatch button. The white hand began to glide across the dial for 14 agonizing seconds in a freezing, pitch-black capsule. At exactly the 14-second mark, they cut the engines. The manual adjustment was a perfect success, and the Speedmaster guided the crew safely back to Earth. This made it earn Omega NASA's highest honor for teamwork and safety, the Silver Snoopy Award. So, what did Rolex do after watching its 6238 fail in a humidity chamber while a competitor walked on the moon? Rolex simply had to move on. They didn't chase the loss with a counter-campaign. Instead, Rolex kept building its reputation around the territories where it already had unmatched credibility. They focused heavily on Earth, marketing their watches to commercial airline pilots and race car drivers. They even named their signature stopwatch the Daytona after the famous Florida racetrack. Interestingly, Rolex GMTs even show up as personal backup watches worn by some crew members on later Apollo missions, just never as NASA's official equipment. Now, the irony of this whole story is that throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, Rolex Daytona sat gathering dust in jewelry stores. Their watches were heavily discounted because everyone wanted the space-proven Omega Moonwatch. Yet today, decades later, a modern steel Rolex Daytona is almost impossible to buy. You need to register on a long waiting list. On the other hand, you can walk right into a store and buy an Omega Speedmaster today. It seems Rolex lost the historical battle for space, but won the long-term war for luxury popularity. So what actually flipped the script? Part of it came down to scarcity and demand. Rolex deliberately kept production numbers tight, even as global demand for steel sports watches exploded in the 2000s and 2010s. This turned the Daytona into a status symbol that you had to wait years for. Omega, meanwhile, kept the Speedmaster widely available, leaning on its space heritage rather than artificial scarcity to sell the watch. One brand chose exclusivity, the other chose accessibility, and collectors responded to each strategy in completely different ways. Now, if Rolex won the popularity contest in the end, why do collectors still pay huge amounts of money for a watch that tells the history of space? The great 1965 NASA watch wars teach us a fundamental lesson about what makes a luxury item valuable. In modern watchmaking, any brand can buy high-tech machinery, use gold or throw diamonds on a dial, but the one thing you can never manufacture or fake is true history. Story creates absolute value. When a collector buys an Omega Speedmaster, they're not just buying a piece of steel and some gears, they're buying a direct link to a tool that saved human lives in the freezing void of space. That historic weight is exactly why watch prices change so drastically based on story alone. Rolex might rule the luxury market today, but Omega owns the moon, and no amount of modern advertising can ever change history. But provenance can cut both ways. The same obsession with history and heritage that makes a moonwatch priceless is exactly what makes the watch industry such fertile ground for fraud. Now, if you think the battle between Omega and Rolex in the 1960s was intense, the modern watch world hides an even darker secret. Our deep dive fake watch expose is up next, and trust us, you're not ready for it. See you there.